So the CHIPS and Science Act was signed into law in 2022, about a year ago, as you heard, ushering a new era in semiconductor research in the US. And today, we're fortunate to be hearing from prominent figures on how the CHIPS Act is shaping their particular agencies. But it actually would not be right to have a CHIPS Act session without starting with our first speaker. She began her career at NIST as a researcher in biomedical engineering and has worked for the agency for 31 years. Now she serves as the 17th director of NIST and the 4th Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology. She's played an essential role in developing and executing the CHIPS Act's provisions. So please welcome to the stage Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Dr. Laurie Locascio.
All right, so thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's go ahead. All right, so I'm going to start my talk today by talking about when the government makes big bets on science and technology. I have to say, looking back in history, there haven't been a lot of them, which is surprising. So it's pretty easy to recap this pretty quickly, but we do have some excellent examples that are really etched in our history when the government has made big bets, and they've really paid off. And so I'll start, of course, with the Manhattan Project. We all know, of course, the devastating impacts of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, and that's the subject of a lot more discussion lately with the release of the film Oppenheimer. But this program also attracted top scientific talent from across the world and helped advance science in many directions beyond the obvious. And it also built scientific facilities across the nation to lead in nuclear and energy research for decades to come. And the program was first funded in 1942. It cost an estimated $367 billion in today's dollars. And it took 2 decades, 20 years later, in 1961, when President Kennedy announced a new project, of course, to put the man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth. And I think there's a really important statement in President Kennedy's now very famous speech at that time to Congress. And he said, "I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are that we have never made national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources or our time so as to ensure their fulfillment." And I think that's a very prescient statement. And this project, of course, showed us the potential to explore space, put US in a position of global scientific leadership for decades to come, and also inspiring generations to come. And the cost in today's dollars for that program is $230 billion. And it took 30 years later, so 3 decades later, the Human Genome Project was launched in 1990 under President Bush's term. And this big bet was funded from 1990 to 2003 with an estimated cost in today's dollars of $7 billion. And this project unlocked the potential for genomics, for understanding and treating disease. It led to new tools for genome sequencing that catapulted a new industry, and it resulted in many new genomics technologies companies, of course. The global genome sequencing market size in 2022 was about $28 billion, according to Grand View Research, with the US leading within approximately 42% of revenue share in 2021. And this does not account for all of the other markets that were created by discoveries from genome sequencing. So these are big bets that have really paid off for the United States. And now we're here, of course, more than 30 years after the Human Genome Project, again, 3 decades later, announcing another big bet by the US government, this time to reclaim our leadership, our global leadership, in advanced semiconductor electronics through the CHIPS Act. And what prompted us, what brought us here? Well, this was articulated several times already, and Pat Gelsinger mentioned it at all. What prompted us to take this big bet at this time in our history? Well, the US is facing many threats despite our longstanding dominance in research innovation. First, the nation is at a critical juncture with respect to our competitive position in today's global economy. And today we face significant competition in technology innovation, and navigating the global digital transition will absolutely be critical to not only our national security, but our overall economic competitiveness for generations to come. Of course, concerns associated with increasing global competition were amplified when we looked at the fragility of our supply chains. That was mentioned as well as disruptions, of course, caused by the pandemic, various natural disasters, lack of global domestic manufacturing capacity, and geopolitical instability. And all of this really became very, very shocking to our economy in the past several years, when we couldn't get those semiconductor chips to fuel our industries. Now, while a lot of attention was focused at that time on the biotech industry, leaders in government and in industry came together and realized that this underpins and has really rocked our economy more than anything else that was going on at the time. And so in this sophisticated audience, we know it's not just about yesterday's technologies that rely on chips. All of our most important critical and emerging technologies rely on semiconductor electronics. Sometimes very specialized chips, of course, for AI, biotech, the emerging quantum economy that was mentioned, and many others. And as was just discussed, as you all know, industry and government did come together to make the big bet on Chips and Science Act. The Act provides $50 billion for the Department of Commerce and NIST in funding over the next 5 years. Now, $39 billion of that is in manufacturing incentives to bring the industry back to the United States more robustly. And more than $11 billion for the Department of Commerce and CHIPS is focused to support R&D programs. And of course, workforce development cuts across all of these. We know we have to get the workforce development right because we have to feed the estimated jobs that will be created from all of this funding. And the estimated jobs were, according to a recent SIA report, are about 180,000 new jobs that will be created with all of this funding. The Act, of course, also funds the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and National Science Foundation, and other agencies. We'll be hearing from them. But achieving these goals for the CHIPS Act, for this very bold CHIPS Act, is a whole of government effort. And the Department of Commerce has been working very, very closely with all of our partner agencies, including, of course, DoD. All right, so Chips for America just celebrated its first birthday, so let's look at some of the program's milestones. And I'm going to focus in particular here on the $39 billion in manufacturing incentives, since the CHIPS R&D Director, Laura Weiss, will be following in after my talk, and she will talk about the $11 billion in research and development funds. So let's start with the current funding opportunities. So under the $39 billion for manufacturing incentives, we announced several new funding opportunities, one in February and one in June this year. The first funding opportunity is really geared toward chip makers, specifically leading edge, current and mature node, and back-end fabrication facilities. And all of this funding is, applications are being accepted for this funding currently. We are accepting on a rolling basis, and we are reviewing applications on a rolling basis as well. The second funding opportunity, the one released in June, really addresses the supply chain issue that we've all been talking about. And so it's for the construction, expansion, or modernization of commercial facilities for semiconductor materials and manufacturing equipment suppliers over $300 million. Now, we've received over 460 statements of interest to date, and this was across all of the funding opportunities and even the future funding opportunities. We asked people to step in, tell us what they need, tell us what they're anticipating applying for. And that's really helped shape the program, helped us set forth our strategies, and help us think about how to best spend this funding for the United States to be successful. So we released two vision papers outlining our strategic objectives related to commercial fabrication facilities and to materials and equipment suppliers. And so I'm going to start by talking about our vision for success for commercial fab facilities. And in this paper, we laid out 4 objectives and 4 targets that we believe we must meet by the end of the decade in order to call this program a success. So a couple of examples of what we are looking to accomplish. First, in leading edge logic, the US will have 2 new large-scale clusters of leading edge logic fabs by the end of the decade. The second, in memory, US-based fabs will produce high-volume memory chips on economically competitive terms in the next decade. In advanced packaging, the US will be home to multiple high-volume advanced packaging facilities and will be a global leader in commercial scale advanced packaging technology for both logic and leading edge logic and memory chips. And finally, in current generation and mature, the US will have strategically increased its production capacity for current generation and mature chips to serve areas of national security, and also to serve, of course, the many, many other sectors across the US that rely on the supply in the United States. For the supply chain funding opportunity, we also laid out a vision for success for materials and equipment suppliers, and we aim to work with US companies, of course, as well as with partners and allies across the world to achieve 3 goals by the end of the decade. First is strengthening the supply chain resilience. The United States and its allies will reduce choke point risks following from geographic concentration and reduce the risks of production disruptions due to chronic shortages of critical supply chain inputs. The second is in the area of advancing US technology leadership. When we are successful, the United States will have incentivized major US equipment and materials suppliers to increase their footprints in the United States. And non-US suppliers of the world's most advanced equipment, materials, and subsystems will likewise have established large-scale footprints here. And finally, we are aiming to support vibrant US fab clusters. Each chip-funded fab cluster in the United States will be supported by dozens of suppliers and surrounded by dozens of suppliers, including many that will be investing here for the first time. So this is our vision, and we intend to achieve these. We believe that targeted investments to realize these strategic objectives will have the greatest impact and address the greatest vulnerabilities and also capitalize on existing US strengths in this critically important supply chain. Okay, so big bets like chips require big minds. We need the best and brightest talent that reflects the ingenuity and the diversity of America, and we have hired a lot of people, 140 people in the past 8 to 9 months. We hired the first CHIP staff member in September 2022, and we continue to grow. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what this team looks like. I think it's important for you to realize the composition of what we're trying to build here. So the team includes national security leaders and experts from the Pentagon and the intelligence community to make sure that we prioritize investments that protect our long-term national security. We've hired economists and former semiconductor industry leaders who know how the industry works. We've hired financial professionals from some of the world's leading financial institutions, private equity firms, and investment firms to make sure that we get taxpayers the best deals possible. They're negotiating our deals for us. We've hired workforce experts who know the ins and outs of what workers in the industry need and who have experience fostering partnerships with universities, with community colleges, with labor unions, with child care providers, and with companies. We've hired lawyers trained in navigating federal, state, and local permitting requirements to really streamline the process for building out these fabs to help companies cut through the red tape while building the cleanest and most energy efficient facilities of their kind. And we've hired microelectronics researchers and technology leaders from the country's best universities and companies who can establish that R&D foundation for decades of technological leadership to come, and also to work on the sector's most difficult and pressing challenges. Now, I want to mention that many of these people have come out of retirement to join the government, specifically because they believe so strongly in CHIPS and in the CHIPS mission, and also because they were ready to do some public service. This is truly a public service mission for the nation. And we are still looking for good people on both the manufacturing side and the CHIPS R&D side. So if you have any interest, please come and approach me. So our strategy for implementing CHIPS has been extensively informed by outreach to you, extensive engagement with the semiconductor industry leaders, with experts in academia, with nonprofits, with local, state, and federal government, with public and private entities, national security entities, labor leaders, and of course, international partners and allies. We are not trying to incentivize a great CHIPS competition across the globe. What we're really trying to do is work with partners and allies to make sure we're running toward the same goals. We've communicated our vision in 5 strategy papers. We've published guides and templates on application procedures. We started a partnering list to help potential applicants find each other. So if you haven't joined that partnering list, I encourage you to do so. That includes industry and university and government. It includes everybody who's looking for a partner, seeking a partner to work with on some CHIPS programs. It now has more than 280 entries. We've held 20 webinars to inform the community about funding opportunities and other programs, and we've traveled to 27 states so far and held more than 50 events to talk broadly to industry and academia and government. So in the last few slides, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our CHIPS R&D funding to tee up what's coming next from Dr. Laura Weiss. This is the $11 billion in funding, and at the head of this, it doesn't say CHIPS R&D, it says institution building, because we are really aiming to establish world-leading technical organizations that will provide the sector with widespread access to cutting-edge capabilities. And as I said, you're going to hear a lot more about this shortly. But in the past year, we've been working to stand up not just 1, but 4 unique entities that can serve the semiconductor industry, and of course, each with a workforce component. The National Semiconductor Technology Center, the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program, Manufacturing USA Institutes, and the NIST metrology program. And we have achieved a great many milestones, building the leadership team, developing strategies, and we have a lot more to come, including the formation of the NSTC that's going to happen soon, and the launching of the Manufacturing USA funding announcement. But I want to highlight that a lot of effort has been put into making sure all of these capabilities and these entities are uniquely aligned and coordinated and complementary. And so that has taken a lot of work in the past year. And we've also worked to align our efforts, in particular with the DoD, with the Microelectronics Commons and other programs within the DoD, of course, including this one. So it will be a very big year for CHIPS R&D. So I've talked about where we've been. Let me just talk about the next few months of where CHIPS is going. Later this year, we are going to be releasing a funding announcement focused on projects under $300 million for materials suppliers and equipment manufacturers. And this will continue to build out that domestic supply chain that we've been talking about. Also, later this year, Commerce will announce a funding opportunity to support the construction of semiconductor R&D facilities. And this funding opportunity is meant to complement the CHIPS R&D programs that I mentioned. But it's really for commercial entities, for those who are interested in continuing to build out R&D capacity in the United States. Now, I should mention here, before I move on to the next slide, that that academic and training organizations will have the opportunity to participate in program and funding opportunities really throughout the CHIPS R&D, and I think that's pretty obvious. But they can also seek commercial partners for opportunities within the CHIPS Manufacturing Incentives Program for really all of these opportunities that I'm talking about today. Okay, so in presentations like this, we typically do separate out manufacturing incentive side of CHIPS, the $39 billion, and the $11 billion side of CHIPS, the CHIPS R&D. But I want to leave you with a cohesive vision for all of CHIPS for America that is being developed right now. So first, what we are creating is a vibrant future for semiconductors in the United States. The manufacturing incentives is really intended to draw manufacturing back to the United States more robustly. But the R&D ecosystem that we are building is meant to really cement that here, to keep them here with all the great innovations that are to come. So we intend, though, deliberately to link the CHIPS Manufacturing Incentives Programs and the CHIPS R&D program. And just to mention one way that we are doing that, we are asking the recipients of CHIPS manufacturing incentives to participate in the NSTC and to inform the design of the programs within the NSTC as they are built. The technical advances, of course, on the R&D side will help to ensure the success of CHIPS manufacturing in this country for decades to come and make the entire US semiconductor ecosystem more successful and more competitive. And as I mentioned, this is a whole of government approach. It's also a whole of sector approach. And in order to accomplish this, we need your involvement. Please get engaged if you aren't already. We intend to be successful in executing on these bold goals for the United States, but we can't do it without you. So thank you, and we look very forward to hearing from you and to your partnership. Thanks.